My name is Beth Nelson. I'll be working with you for the next several hours. So we're going to talk about HIPAA training. So we're going to look at HIPAA, high-tech, some of the regulations certainly and guidance that guide what we do in clinical research. We'll certainly start with a background of why we have this regulation to begin with. Suffice it to say, in clinical research as a whole, as you probably know from good clinical practice training, we have regulations in place, not necessarily proactively, but mostly reactively, because some things happened. So this is really no different with HIPAA and high-tech. This is an overview course. We're going to talk about the history. We're going to talk about definitions. We're going to talk about impact on research. And as I said, if you have questions specific to your group, don't hesitate to ask those, and we'll keep a tab of those, and we will get back to you as well. So this is a training course, as we mentioned, basic overview of HIPAA and the updates to the rules. It's not meant to provide legal advice, and we certainly encourage you to talk to your institutional legal representatives, your privacy offices, those sort of things for information specific to those potential legal questions. So as I mentioned earlier, we're going to talk about the history of HIPAA and its impact on clinical research. I am an auditor, so ever since I started auditing, we have seen this be an issue. So HIPAA high-tech came in later, but I've been auditing since 2002, and we have seen this, frankly, in my opinion, one of the most misunderstood pieces of regulation as it pertains to clinical research. So we'll talk about the history, how we got there, how we have updated it as we've moved along, and interestingly enough, from what we see in this world, not just in the clinical research arena, but we have been keeping pretty on point with this in terms of how DHHS updates this in terms of what's happening out there. The FDA has been cited by the Office of Inspector General, for example, for not updating their regulations, for really trying to train us on how to do things with warning letters and guidance documents, but not updating the regulations to reflect what's happening within industry. So we have to think about how we use this information. And we're going to talk about the distinction there. So we'll talk about the history, how we got there. Again, suffice it to say, it's because things have popped up. We'll talk about key terminology and concepts that are specific to the use of protected health information in clinical research. We'll talk about the roles of covered entities and their responsibilities. We'll also talk about business associates, what they are, what they might not be. We'll look at the enforcement rule for HIPAA, and we'll talk about the impact on the new Omnibus HIPAA Rulemaking Act. So this was enacted in January of 2013, and it really kind of combines all of these regulations together. So we'll see 45 CFR 160, 162, and 164 that we'll talk about in terms of how they particularly apply to us in clinical research. So first we'll talk about the history of the Health Information Portability and Accountability Act in and of itself, and then see how we get that progression to its impact on research. So as we said, we're going to look at those three areas of focus. And the thought was with HIPAA that there would be the potential for portability and access to those health benefits. So we could take our information, move it around as patients, and get the care we need. Preventing fraud and abuse in healthcare. And again, as I mentioned, a lot of the times we see regulations enacted because there has been an issue. So preventing that fraud and abuse in healthcare, information doesn't get out. We know nowadays, when we first started with focusing on the Privacy Act, it was really looking at those paper records primarily. But now, and we'll talk about the Security Act, really looking at electronic health information, how it moves and how we use it. And then, of course, because the government likes to do this, looking at the potential for administrative simplification. Kind of like saying that to prove that you are 100% paper-free, you have to have reams of paper, right, with your validation documentation, which is always slightly amusing. So the administrative simplification is trying to standardize electronic financial and administrative data transactions in healthcare. So there was a lot of disparity in terms of how information was captured and moving around. So this was a national standardization for healthcare provider identifiers. And the thought was we can move through these systems more seamlessly if we have safeguards in place for how that data needs to move. So this also looks at the approach for not just that patient use of protected health information, of course, but for researchers as well. So the thought here was to improve privacy and security of health information. And as I mentioned earlier, we will look at 45 CFR 160, 162, and 164, with particular focus on 45 CFR 164, those areas that are specific to research.